Calix sat on his bed, his fingers strumming the strings of his guitar. It was his only solace after a long day of being teased and ridiculed. He had been playing for years, watching countless YouTube videos and practicing relentlessly. But despite his best efforts, he knew he wasn't good enough. He couldn't help but wonder what was wrong with him. Even his family teased him, mocking his constant guitar playing, making jokes about his lack of progress. But Calix couldn't help himself. He was desperate to be good at guitar, to be respected for his skill. He knew it was unlikely, but he couldn't stop trying. One night, while browsing YouTube, he stumbled upon a video about the legendary blues musician Robert Johnson. The story went that Johnson had sold his soul to the devil at a crossroads to become a great guitar player. Calix was fascinated. He had heard the story before, but he had never really thought much about it. He began listening to Johnson's music religiously. He studied his guitar playing, trying to pick up any tips or tricks that he could. But he knew that he could never be as good as Johnson, not without making a deal with the devil. Despite his initial skepticism, Calix became obsessed with the idea of making a deal with the devil. He spent hours researching the details of Johnson's story, reading old books and articles. He learned about the history and culture of the region, the strange and supernatural occurrences that were said to happen there. Finally, he made his decision. He was going to try to summon the devil at a crossroads and make a deal. He didn't care about the consequences, he was desperate for success. On a hot summer night, Calix set out to find a crossroads. He had heard that they were scattered throughout the deep south, but he didn't know where to start. He wandered aimlessly through the countryside, the humid air clinging to his skin. The moon was full and bright, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. After several hours of walking, Calix finally stumbled upon a crossroads. Calix walked up to the crossroads, the dirt road leading him to a place that felt both familiar and strange. The moon cast an eerie glow over the scene, bathing everything in a pale, ghostly light. The tall trees that lined the road rustled in the warm summer breeze, their leaves whispering secrets to each other. In the distance, he could hear the distant sound of crickets chirping and owls hooting, the only sounds in this desolate corner of the world. As he neared the crossroads, Calix could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was as if the air was charged with a strange electricity, a power that he couldn't quite comprehend. The crossroads themselves were little more than a collection of dirt paths, a place where the road to nowhere met the path to oblivion. It was said that at midnight, the devil himself would appear here, ready to make a deal with anyone foolish enough to summon him. But Calix was not afraid. He had been preparing for this moment for years, studying every book and legend he could find, desperate to find a way to become the guitar player he had always dreamed of being. As he stood at the crossroads, the night seemed to grow even darker, as if the world was holding its breath in anticipation. The trees seemed to loom over him, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. But despite the eerie atmosphere, Calix felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. This was where he was meant to be, he realized. This was his destiny. And with that thought in mind, he summoned the devil. But nothing happened. Calix waited for what felt like hours, but no one came. He was about to give up and go home when he heard a rustling in the bushes. Calix stood at the crossroads, his guitar slung over his shoulder, and a sense of foreboding growing inside him. As the midnight hour approached, the air grew thick with humidity, and the heat seemed to bear down on him with an oppressive weight. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, and Calix's heart leaped into his throat. It was the devil himself, standing before him in a long black coat, his eyes glowing red in the dim light of the moon. Calix was sure of it. The devil's voice was smooth and oily, like honey poured over a razor blade. It was a voice that seemed to seep into Calix's very bones, filling him with a sense of dread and unease.
"You called Calix,"
the devil said, his voice dripping with malice.
And I have come.
As he spoke, the devil's form seemed to shift and writhe, like a serpent in the darkness. His face was twisted in a sinister grin, his eyes blazing with an otherworldly fire. Calix tried to speak, but his throat was dry and constricted. He could feel the sweat pouring down his face, the guitar strap digging into his shoulder. The devil approached him, and Calix could feel the heat radiating off his body. He could smell the acrid scent of brimstone and sulfur, and the sickly sweet smell of decay. The devil's hand shot out and gripped Calix's wrist, and he could feel the burning touch of his skin. It was like holding a live wire, and Calix felt a surge of pain shoot through his arm.
Are you the devil?
Calix asked, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a guitar and began to play. The notes were slow and mournful, full of pain and longing. Calix couldn't help but be entranced by the music. As the devil man played, he began to speak.
What is it that you seek, boy?
Calix didn't hesitate.
I want to be a great guitar player. I want to be as good as Robert Johnson.
The man smiled, and his eyes gleamed in the darkness.
And what are you willing to give me in return?
Calix didn't know what to say. He hadn't thought that far ahead.
Anything.
He said finally.
Anything you want.
The man nodded. He continued to play his guitar, the haunting notes echoing through the night. Calix watched, transfixed, as the man's fingers moved effortlessly over the strings.
Very well. I will make you a deal. I will give you the talent you desire, but in return, you must give me your soul.
Calix felt a shiver run down his spine. He had known this was a possibility, but he hadn't truly believed it would happen.
I don't know.
He stammered.
I don't know if I'm ready to give up my soul.
The man chuckled.
You have come all this way, boy. You have sought me out, just as Robert Johnson did. Do you really think you can turn back now?
Calix hesitated. He knew that the man was right. He had come too far to back down now. He took a deep breath and nodded.
Okay.
He said, his voice barely above a whisper.
Okay, I'll do it.
The man smiled, and Calix felt a sense of dread wash over him. The man's face was still shrouded in shadow, but he could see the glint of his eyes in the moonlight.
Very well,
the man said.
Give me your guitar.
Calix handed over his beloved instrument, feeling a pang of regret. He had worked so hard to become even mediocre, and now he was giving it all up. The man began to play Calix's guitar, and as he did, he started to sing. His voice was deep and mournful, full of pain and suffering. Calix felt a sense of awe wash over him. This was like nothing he had ever heard before. As the man played and sang, Calix felt something shift inside of him. He felt a strange energy building, like a current of electricity running through his body. It was almost painful, but he didn't dare move. Finally, the man stopped playing. He handed Calix back his guitar, and Calix felt a sense of anticipation. He knew that something had changed, that he had been given the talent he had always desired. He strummed his guitar, and to his amazement, he felt the notes flow effortlessly from his fingers. He played a few chords, and they were perfect. He couldn't believe it. He looked up at the man, who was still standing in the shadows.
Thank you.
He said, his voice filled with wonder.
Thank you so much.
The man nodded.
You're welcome,
he said.
But remember, you have given me your soul. You will be mine when you die.
Calix felt a pang of fear, but he pushed it aside. He had what he wanted, and he was willing to pay the price. He played his guitar all the way home, unable to believe how much he had improved. He was playing like a pro, like nothing he had ever heard before. When he got home, he couldn't wait to show his family. He ran into the living room where his parents were watching TV.
Listen to this.
He exclaimed, strumming his guitar. His parents looked up, and for a moment, they were stunned into silence. Then his mother burst out laughing.
What's so funny?
Calix asked, feeling a sinking feeling in his chest.
You're still terrible.
His mother said, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes.
I don't know what you're so excited about.
Calix felt his heart sink. He had been so sure it would work. Calix's family continued to mock him, even after he played for them again, showing off his newfound talent. His siblings teased him mercilessly, and his parents just shook their heads and laughed. Calix was hurt by their lack of support, but he tried to ignore it. He was determined to become the best guitar player he could be, and he knew that he had the talent to do it now. He started playing in public, performing at small venues around town. He quickly gained a following, and people started to take notice of him. He was invited to play at bigger and bigger events, and soon he was touring the country, playing to packed crowds every night. But even as his career soared, Calix felt a sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that he had made a terrible mistake by selling his soul to the devil. He tried to push the feeling aside, but it only grew stronger. He started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying dreams that left him shaking and covered in sweat. In his dreams, he saw the man he had made the deal with, his face twisted into a grotesque mask. He heard the man's voice, deep and menacing, promising to claim his soul. Calix tried to ignore the dreams, but they continued to haunt him. He started to feel like he was being watched, like someone was following him everywhere he went. One night, after a particularly bad nightmare, he decided to go for a walk. It was late, and the streets were empty. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over everything. As he walked, he felt the sense of being watched growing stronger. He turned around, but there was no one there. He quickened his pace, but the feeling only grew stronger. Finally, he reached a crossroads. It was the same crossroads where he had made the deal with the devil. He felt a chill run down his spine. Suddenly, he heard a voice behind him.
Hello, Calix.
He spun around, but there was no one there. The voice had been deep and menacing, just like the man he had made the deal with.
Who's there?
He called out, his heart pounding. There was no answer. He turned to leave, but he felt a hand on his shoulder. He spun around, but again, there was no one there. He started to run, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't stop until he was back at his hotel, safe behind locked doors. The next day, he received a package in the mail. It was a single black rose, with a note attached that read simply,
I'm coming for you, Calix.
He tried to shrug it off, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. At his next concert, something strange happened. He was playing his guitar, lost in the music, when he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his fingers. He looked down and saw that his fingers had started to bleed, as if the strings had cut into his flesh. He tried to keep playing, but the pain was too much. He stumbled off stage, feeling weak and dizzy. He was rushed to the hospital, where he was diagnosed with a rare blood disorder. The doctors told him that he would never be able to play guitar again, that the damage to his fingers was irreversible. Calix was devastated. He knew that he had brought this on himself, that he had made a deal with the devil, and now he was paying the price. He retreated from public life, disappearing from the music scene completely. He moved to a small cabin in the deep south, where he could be alone with his thoughts. He spent his days lost in self-pity, wallowing in regret for the choice he had made. But even in his isolation, he couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. He heard strange noises in the night, whispers in the dark that he couldn't quite make out. One night, he was awakened by a loud banging on his door. He stumbled out of bed and made his way to the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. When he opened the door, he was greeted by a figure in a long black coat, his face hidden in the shadows.
Calix,
The figure said, his voice deep and menacing.
our deal is not yet complete. You still owe me.
Calix tried to slam the door shut, but the figure's foot blocked it.
You can't run from me, Calix.
The figure said.
You made a deal with me, and you will keep your end of the bargain.
Calix felt a sense of dread wash over him. He knew that he had made a terrible mistake, that he had sold his soul to the devil for a fleeting moment of fame. But he was determined not to let the devil win. He took a deep breath and faced the figure head on.
I made a mistake,
He said.
but I'm not going to let you control my life anymore. I'm done with this.
The figure laughed, a deep, sinister sound that echoed through the night.
You don't get to walk away from me, Calix.
He said.
I own you.
But Calix refused to back down. He stood his ground, facing the figure with all the courage he could muster. Suddenly, the figure disappeared, leaving Calix alone in the darkness. Calix thought he had won, that he had broken free from the devil's grasp. He felt a sense of relief wash over him, a weight lifted from his shoulders. He decided to start playing guitar again, not for fame or fortune, but for the love of the music. He practiced every day, honing his skills and perfecting his craft. Years went by, and Calix became known as one of the best guitar players in the Deep South. People came from all over to hear him play, and he played with a passion and skill that had never been seen before. But the feeling of being watched never left him, and the whispers in the night continued. One night, while he was playing a show, he saw the figure in the long black coat standing in the back of the room. His heart skipped a beat as he realized that the devil had come to collect his due. Calix tried to keep playing, but his fingers felt heavy and unresponsive. The devil's presence was suffocating, and he could barely breathe. He knew that he had made a mistake, that he had sold his soul to the devil for a fleeting moment of fame. As he played the final note, the figure in the long black coat approached him.
Calix,
The figure said, his voice deep and menacing.
it's time to pay the piper.
Calix tried to run, but he couldn't move. He was frozen in place, trapped by the devil's power. The figure grabbed him by the arm and pulled him close.
You thought you could outsmart me, Calix,
The figure said, his voice cold and unforgiving.
but you were wrong. You belong to me now, body and soul.
Calix felt a surge of fear wash over him as the figure led him away. He knew that he had made a terrible mistake, that he had sold his soul for a fleeting moment of fame. And now, he was going to pay the price for that mistake for all eternity.